Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jose, for that kind introduction. I want to thank the Bailey Matthews National Shell Museum for inviting me to speak to you guys tonight about this important topic. Of course, water quality and the water is the lifeblood of our economy. And my presentation tonight is going to focus on Southwest Florida's water quality challenges and the urgent need to complete Everglades restoration. But in addition to Everglades restoration, there's also a number of projects that we need to do right here within the Caloosahatchee watershed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. I'm going to leave out some of the details of what we're doing here locally. Hopefully at some point we can come back and talk about all the things that the city of Sanibel and all of the folks here locally are doing to improve water quality. But I'm focusing on the regional aspects of water quality. And of course, at the end of my presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions. So please think about what questions you want to ask and submit those to Jose, and we can get those answered at the end of the presentation. So Florida is really in the midst of a water quality crisis. It's a crisis that's been more than a century in the making. And of course, water quality issues are impacting every aspect of our lives, from the ecology of our waters to the quality of our life, to our property values and the viability of our local businesses and our tourism-based economy. And most water bodies right now in the state of Florida are currently impaired for some parameters, such as nutrients. Nitrogen and phosphorus, of course, are nutrients that actually can fuel algal growth. Just like on the land, nitrogen and phosphorus can grow plants, and algae is, of course, a plant. And excess nutrients that go into our waterways can drive these algae blooms. And of course, the photos you see here are just examples of some of the water quality impacts we've seen around the state of Florida. And of course, these are not inviting images for anybody thinking about moving to the state of Florida or any visitor coming to the state to spend money and contribute to our local economy. And of course, in Southwest Florida, we're no stranger to water quality issues. In 2018, our communities were devastated by harmful algal blooms. The photos on your left show an extensive blue-green algae bloom in the Caloosahatchee, which extended the entire length of the river, almost 70 miles in the entire river. And the bloom lasted for almost 4 months, from from the end of May to about October. So that had a tremendous impact on the people living along the Caloosahatchee in North Fort Myers and in the Cape Coral Canal system. And of course, we know well that right after we started to see the blue-green algae blooms that started occurring in May and June, that was shortly followed by a red tide event that impacted Sanibel and our local beaches starting in July of 2018. And the image in the lower middle shows a 26-foot long whale shark that washed up on Sanibel's beaches, dead as a result of red tide and brevetoxicosis. The red tide organism produces a toxin that can actually kill wildlife, even wildlife as large as this whale shark. And the images on your right show the impacts of that intense red tide bloom on the extensive fish kills that washed into our East End Canal system. Pictured in the upper right-hand photo there, you'll see at the time Mayor Kevin Ruane with Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Reynolds and City Councilwoman, which is now our Vice Mayor, Holly Smith, looking at the damage of the red tide bloom in our canal system. And you can also see that the water looks a little green, and that's because we were starting to see the blue-green algae that was washing out of the Caloosahatchee into the East End Canal system. While the blue-green algae bloom wasn't thriving because the salt in the canal system was high enough that it didn't support the blue-green algae in the canal system, we kind of saw both of those harmful algal blooms coming together in the East End Canal system, which of course had a tremendous impact on the property owners and their quality of life at the time. So, of course, water quality impacts Florida's economy. There's no question about it. In a world where we're connected through social media, news travels very fast, and of course, bad news travels even faster. And unfortunately, all that negative press and the images remain on the web forever. And it's a constant reminder of the water quality challenges that we face. And if we don't do something to counter the ongoing problem, Florida is going to kill its golden goose, which is tourism. And these are some examples of some of the news releases and articles that have come out over the last few years. And you can see clearly it's not just Southwest Florida that's being impacted by water quality, but it's everywhere throughout the state. From the springs in North Florida to Lake Okeechobee, to of course the Southwest Florida estuaries. And of course, as a result, Governor Scott in 2018 actually declared 2 separate states of emergency to address these red tide blooms and blue-green algae blooms, to authorize emergency funding to help clean those blooms and impacts from our beaches up. Because of course that was directly impacting Florida's economy. And so, of course, we all know very well that water quality can have a huge impact on our economy here in Southwest Florida as well. And our tourism-based economy is dependent on our beautiful beaches, our natural areas, our waterways, and our world-class fisheries. And in Lee County, tourism employs 1 out of every 5 people and generates more than $3 billion annually. And water quality can also impact our property values. And there was a study that was completed by the Florida Realtors in 2015 that showed water quality and water clarity can impact property values in Lee and Martin counties by almost $1 billion. In Lee County alone, water quality and clarity impacted property values by approximately $541 million. And in 2018, the city of Sanibel removed more than 425 tons of dead marine life from Sanibel's beaches at a cost of $1.6 billion. And of course, we also know the harmful algal blooms, such as the blue-green algae and the red tide, they have a tremendous impact on our economy. And at the same time, the Sanibel-Captiva Chamber of Commerce reported a $47 million economic loss associated with the 2018 red tide event and blue-green algae blooms. So of course, that's just one event that occurred between July and December of 2018. And of course, these have long-lasting impacts on our economy. So we need to do something about it. In addition to the economic impacts, we also know that poor water quality can impact our quality of life and in some cases our human health. And there are many species of algae capable of producing toxins. The one pictured here is a type of blue-green algae called microcystis. It's capable of producing a toxin called microcystin. And every year we get more data on the impacts of these toxins and their relationship between harmful algal blooms and human health effects. And recently, scientists have discovered a link between an amino acid called BMAA, which is beta-methylaminoalanine, which is produced by many cyanobacteria, and it is linked to neurodegenerative disorders such as ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. And of course, this is very concerning as we continue to see an increase in cyanobacteria associated with poor water quality. And we can only expect this to get worse with increasing populations and warmer water temperatures as a result of climate change. So these water quality issues also have ecological impacts. And, of course, we've seen a number of the ecological impacts to our coastal waters over the years. I've worked for the city of Sanibel for over 20 years as a biologist and resource manager. And we documented many of these impacts, including that image in the center, upper center of the slide here. And that was a red drift algae bloom that occurred between 2005 and 2007, where our beaches were almost entirely covered with drift algae. Of course, that directly impacted foraging opportunities for our wading birds and shorebirds that forage along our beaches. It impacted the ability of our sea turtles to nest on the beaches and for the hatchlings to reach the water once they hatch from the nests. Of course, these nutrients that enter the waterways also contribute to the harmful algal blooms that can rob the water of oxygen. And that image in the lower right-hand side, that map showing the red and pink colors there, is a map that was put together by the SCCF Marine Lab that shows low dissolved oxygen levels throughout the region, covering almost 460 square miles of area along Sanibel-Captiva, following the red tide bloom that occurred in 2018. And the dissolved oxygen levels were so low that they weren't suitable for life in the waters. And of course, that had an impact on many of the fish, are economically and ecologically important finfish and shellfish. They were just pretty much devoid of the area was devoid of those organisms for a long period of time. And these events take a long time for the systems to recover. While the systems are resilient and they can bounce back, there is a recovery period that it takes for these systems to recover. And the image in the lower middle there is an image that was taken in 2006 at the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. And that was a bloom of an algae called Cladophora that was essentially blanketing the refuge. And as that algae bloom broke down, it actually removed all of the oxygen from the water. There were fish kills, and of course the wading birds that forage in those areas had nowhere to forage because the area was just completely blanketed. The seagrasses were covered with this algae, and of course that took years to recover. And of course, the refuge depends on tourism, and at the time there was really not a lot to see at the refuge at the time. But it's not just the nutrients, it's not just the algae that impact our coastal waters and the ecology of our waters. It's also salinity, the salt content of the water. And of course, as we see these high flows that discharges that come from Lake Okeechobee or come from the Caloosahatchee watershed, it can actually lower salinity levels throughout the estuary. And as we get lower salinity levels in the lower estuary and into the bay or into the Gulf of Mexico, we can see direct impacts to our oysters and seagrass beds. Of course, they need a certain salinity level, and if it gets too low, it can impact those organisms. And again, it can take years for those systems to recover. And then in the upper estuary, the Caloosahatchee is a little unique because, we depend on fresh water during the wet season to balance salinity. In the upper estuary, we have an organism called tape grass. It's a freshwater grass that used to grow and cover thousands of acres in the upper Caloosahatchee. Because of high salinities during the dry season, that resource has been completely lost since 2000. Since the year 2000 because of water mismanagement issues. So again, it's not just the nutrients, it's not just the algae blooms, but it's also the balance of salinity within the system that's necessary to keep these ecological systems intact. And so one of the questions I get very often is what are the differences between blue-green algae and red tide? And of course, cyanobacteria or blue-green algae refer to several species of bacteria that produce blue-green colored pigments. You can see the image on the left-hand side of your screen there. That's an image of a canal system in Cape Coral. Not only do you notice that the water is very green, but you'll also notice that the lawns along the waterway are very green as well, which may be contributing to the problem. But of course, many of the blue-green algae species that we're familiar with and the harmful algal blooms that we often see in our waters originate from freshwater species of blue-green algae. Although we do have many marine species of cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, such as Trichodesmium that's in the open oceans and the open Gulf, and they're very important for producing oxygen and they provide other important ecological and ecosystem services. But blue-green algae in particular can produce toxins that can be harmful to humans and of course wildlife. And of course, they're also unsightly and can be something that can directly impact property values as well as our environment. And red tide, on the other hand, is caused by a marine dinoflagellate called Karenia brevis. And Karenia brevis produces a potent neurotoxin that can impact fish, wildlife, and humans, especially those humans with respiratory irritation or respiratory issues, I should say, such as asthma, emphysema, or other respiratory issues. So, obviously, when we have these red tide blooms, people that have those issues, chronic or acute issues, should leave the beach. We certainly want to make sure that people are safe And red tide blooms typically start 10 to 40 miles off of the coast of Florida, near the West Florida shelf. And the real epicenter for red tide blooms is really from Sarasota County all the way down to Collier County. And we know that red tide blooms have been around for a long time. They're not a new phenomenon. They've been around since the Spanish arrived in Florida. And they're going to be here, to the end of time. But, while they are natural in nature, we do think that the things that we're doing on the landscape can have a direct impact on red tide. And we know, and we have pretty good confidence that red tide blooms are not caused by or initiated by the things we do on the landscape. But we're pretty confident that the nutrients that come off the landscape can actually exacerbate or fuel the red tide blooms once they move from offshore to the nearshore waters, where they can come into contact with those nutrients that come from our landscapes. So what are the factors that impact our water quality? And so many of the water quality challenges in Florida really stem from the large-scale land use changes that have occurred over the past century, primarily to accommodate agricultural and urban development. Many of Florida's wetlands, rivers, and other water bodies, especially in Florida, have been altered specifically to facilitate drainage of the landscape. And these large-scale landscape changes have resulted in the loss of water storage and treatment, delivering water to the coast very quickly with little to no treatment of that water. And the landscape changes, combined with rapid population growth, development, and increased stormwater runoff containing fertilizers like nitrogen and phosphorus, have contributed to Florida's current water quality crisis. So what are some of the nutrient sources that we're talking about here? Most of the nutrient sources impacting our water bodies come from urban and agricultural runoff, stormwater runoff, wastewater discharge, septic leaching, and municipal reuse water, which can also contribute. While municipal reuse water is a great resource because we're not using potable water to irrigate, if it's not treated to a high enough standard, it can actually contribute high levels of nutrients to our waterways. That's one of the reasons why the city of Sanibel is investing more than $20 million in upgrading the Donex water reclamation facility to take the nitrogen and phosphorus out of that water. So when it's delivered to the end users, like the golf courses and condominiums and other water users on the island for irrigation, that it's cleaner and it doesn't produce nutrients or provide nutrients that can fuel those harmful algal blooms in our waterways or in our groundwater. So that's an important project, and that's why the city of Sanibel has made that a top priority and found that that's a great investment for our community. And so, of course, other issues that that we're dealing with, in our water bodies is eutrophication, and eutrophication is the process of nutrient enrichment, where a water body becomes so productive that it becomes hypereutrophic or overproductive. And at that point, we start to see degradation within the system and impacts to the organisms that live in those water bodies. We can actually see internal cycling of nutrients. And it's very difficult once we start to see that cycle to break that cycle. And so, the graphic on the right there shows the process of eutrophication, where that primary productivity in the water body is enriched to the point where it becomes overproductive and eutrophic. And again, that can really result in an imbalance in the system, and that results in the algae blooms, depressed oxygen levels, and of course, ultimately can result in fish kills. And in addition to the nutrients and other things that can impact water quality, climate change can also have an impact on our water quality. We know that climate change will change weather patterns, resulting in more intense storm events and increased rainfall. With that increased rainfall, we're going to see more stormwater runoff from the landscape, carrying with it the nutrients that enter our waterways. Because many cyanobacteria and our red tide, the organism Karenia brevis, they really prefer warmer water temperatures. And as those water temperatures increase, we can expect to see more frequent and prolonged bloom events with the warmer climate. And so that's, again, very concerning. And warmer oceans can also impact coral reefs and other organisms that may be at the upper end of the temperature thresholds for these organisms. And I know Jose is going to talk about this, at the next, during his next lecture, but higher amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will also impact the pH of our oceans, further impacting shellfish and filter feeders that help to improve our water quality. So, that's another important aspect, of climate change and how it will impact, our waterways. And these circles just kind of show you some of the areas that I was focusing on and the impact to water quality. Of course, we don't have mountains, so we don't have to worry about snowmelt here in Florida. But we do have Lake Okeechobee, and with more frequent storm events, whether those are tropical storm events or just, average storm events, we can expect to see more rainfall and more water being discharged. And of course, at the same time, we're seeing sea levels rising, which have an impact on our estuaries. Because of saltwater intrusion, that saltwater is pushing farther up into the estuaries. And in a system like the Caloosahatchee, where we have locks and dams that actually restrict the movement of water into the estuary, those locks can actually create impingement points where wildlife can't move up into the areas where there's appropriate salinities, where the low salinity zone, which is a lower salinity zone that ranges between about 5 and 6 parts per thousand, that can't move upstream because of the Franklin Lock and Dam that separates the freshwater portion from the saltwater portion of the estuary. And of course, we expect that's going to have a direct impact on the organisms within the estuary. And with saltwater intrusion, we're going to need more fresh water coming from either the watershed or Lake Okeechobee to help push that saltwater wedge back out in the estuary so those organisms have habitat to thrive. And the other challenge that we deal with here in Southwest Florida that many other communities throughout the country really don't have to deal with is the impact of the Central and Southern Florida project on the Caloosahatchee and our coastal waters. The Caloosahatchee is part of a much larger water management system that extends just south of Orlando. And Southwest Florida's water quality is impacted by those land use changes that have occurred, to the water management system that was altered dating back all the way to the 1880s. And that water management system, starts just south of Orlando and extends south into Lake Okeechobee, south into the Everglades, east to the St. Lucie River and estuary, and west to the Caloosahatchee. And the Central and Southern Florida project was authorized by Congress in 1930 as part of the Rivers and Harbor Act. And the goal of that project was really to extend the drainage work that began in the 1880s and provide flood control for South Florida, really to facilitate the development of the landscape for agricultural and urban development. And this was achieved by straightening the Kissimmee River and the Caloosahatchee, creating a series of ditches and canals along the east coast of Florida and throughout the Everglades system. And unfortunately, it worked well, and it had unintended consequences to the ecosystem and the water quality of South Florida. And the map on your left shows the Caloosahatchee watershed covering more than 850,000 acres of land. And just to put that in perspective, that's almost twice the size of Lake Okeechobee, which covers about 730 square miles or 450,000 acres of land. And so the Central and South Florida project was a project that was really managed by the Army Corps of Engineers, at the direction of the United States Congress and supported by Florida, of course, at the time. This is a map of the Caloosahatchee showing the canal, or the C-43 canal as it's referred to, with the meandering Caloosahatchee and its oxbows in blue. And you can see what the river used to look like. The meandering river used to provide a significant amount of treatment to the Caloosahatchee. And of course, prior to the ditching and draining of the system, the Caloosahatchee wasn't actually connected directly to Lake Okeechobee. It was the only time the Caloosahatchee was directly connected to the Caloosahatchee was when the water levels in Lake Okeechobee got to a critical point and crested over the berms or the ridges along the western sides of Lake Okeechobee, and they spilled into the marsh and the lake system of the eastern Caloosahatchee, which of course has been ditched and drained. And this is today what it looks like. You can see that dark line going through the middle there. And of course, that had a direct impact on the quality of the water within the Caloosahatchee. And it created a number of different issues. Because of the changes that have occurred to the water management system, the loss of water storage and treatment, the Caloosahatchee was impacted by really too much water during the rainy season and too little water during the dry season. And those are the issues that we really deal with on an annual basis. And it's having an impact on not only the ecology of our waters, but it's also having a direct impact on our economy, as I talked about earlier. The images on the left show the impact of too much water with a dark freshwater plume extending along the Lighthouse Beach Park. This was in June of 2018 when the freshwater releases from Lake Okeechobee pushed down the Caloosahatchee and started to enter the coastal waters. Ultimately, that freshwater plume extended, like approximately 10 miles offshore. And that dark water plume has a direct impact on our seagrasses. It shades out the seagrasses and can impact the ecology of the seagrasses. And the nutrients that come with that water can fuel the harmful algal blooms that I talked about earlier. And the images on the right show the impact of too little freshwater flow to the Caloosahatchee, with an algae bloom, depicted in that upper right-hand photo there in June of 2008 on the upper Caloosahatchee. The image there, the upper image there is the Franklin Lock and Dam structure, with the lower portion of that picture being the eastern Caloosahatchee towards Lake Okeechobee, and the upper right or northern portion of that image being the estuary. And you can see that the lock completely cut off flows to the Caloosahatchee at the time, resulting in a blue-green algae bloom that extended almost all the way up the river to the lake. And so of course that had an impact on wildlife, robbing the water of dissolved oxygen. And it also had a direct impact on the salinity levels in the estuary because the salinity got so high that it directly impacted the freshwater tape grass in the upper estuary. As I mentioned earlier, we've lost almost 1,000 acres of freshwater tape grass habitat since 2000 because of water mismanagement. And of course, oysters are also directly impacted by having either too much salinity or too little salinity. In this case, you can see the impact in the lower right-hand corner of this image, where the oyster reef had been completely killed as a result of being deluged with too much water and then not getting enough water during the dry season. So what are the solutions? So the real solutions to addressing our problems is Everglades restoration. And the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan will significantly improve conditions in the Caloosahatchee. While it won't solve all of our problems, because part of our problem is still, still going to be there even after Everglades restoration because of the large area of the Caloosahatchee watershed. The comprehensive Everglades restoration plan will make conditions considerably better for the northern estuaries of the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie. And CERP is really all about getting the water right. And the plan includes 68 project components designed to restore the quality, quantity, timing, and distribution of freshwater flows to the South Florida ecosystem, while providing for water-related needs of the region, including water supply and flood protection. So it's not just about ecosystem restoration. It's about ensuring that we have enough water to supply the 8 million people living in South Florida with water supply and being able to provide water supply for agricultural purposes. So it's all about balancing those project purposes. And the plan was authorized in Congress in 2000. And at the time, it was anticipated to take 30 years to complete at a total cost of $8.2 billion. And today, CERP is estimated to cost more than $20 billion, and projects are already scheduled out to 2029. So, we're looking at trying to complete all of those projects over the next, from 30 years starting in 2000. But of course, to get there, it's going to require a significant increase in funding over the next 4 years. And it's estimated that we need somewhere around $725 million appropriated from Congress for the next 4 years annually, for a total funding for the next 4 years of $2.9 billion. So we know that's going to be a heavy lift. Of course, last year, the Trump administration approved $250 million for Everglades restoration as the federal cost share, and that was record funding levels. So getting to a $725 million level is going to take a lot of effort and support from everybody that's listening here today. If you care about Everglades restoration and you care about our water quality, I would encourage you to reach out to your legislators and make sure you let them know that this is a top priority for you, because we can't get there without Everglades restoration. And of course, CERP projects require a 50-50 cost share between the state of Florida and the federal government. And right now, the state of Florida is considerably ahead in the funding aspect compared to the federal government. So we need to get the federal government to pay up and contribute their share. And each of the projects in CERP depend on one another and create synergy to provide system-wide benefits to achieve the goals of CERP. And there are also a number of non-CERP projects that the state and federal agencies are working on that are integral to the restoration of South Florida ecosystems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those CERP and non-CERP priority projects. And so CERP really is dependent on getting the water right, and a big part of that is water storage. And the graphic on the right here shows a water budget. I don't expect you to know what that all means, but I'll just explain really briefly, what it means. It's all about really getting the water right, and not only is it about water storage, but it's also having the ability to convey that water south into the Everglades. And that's really what is going to reduce the damaging discharges to our estuaries. It's estimated that we're going to need approximately 1 million acre feet of water storage to the north of Lake Okeechobee, almost 1 million acre feet of storage south, included with that conveyance, so that we can move that water into the Everglades and Florida Bay where it's desperately needed. We need about 2,000 acre feet of water stored on the east side to provide beneficial flows and moderate those harmful discharges to the East Coast and the St. Lucie estuary. And it's estimated that we need between 400 and 450,000 acre feet of water storage within the Caloosahatchee watershed to provide those beneficial releases during the dry season, and of course, cut those harmful discharges from the watershed during the wet season. And I should probably explain an acre foot of water. Just to put that in perspective, 1 acre foot of water is an acre of land with a foot of water stacked on it. So imagine a football field, which is approximately an acre, with a foot of water on it. And then you can imagine, what 1 million acre feet of water. Imagine, a million acre feet stacked on top of one another. That's a pretty significant volume of water that we're dealing with. And that would explain the cost of many of these capital projects in the more than $20 billion needed for CERP restoration. And so one of the most important projects that will help restore the freshwater flows to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie estuaries, and of course the Everglades, is the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir. It's a part of the Central Everglades Planning Project, which includes a suite of projects designed to move water through the central portion of the Everglades. And the projects in CEPP, also, the Central Everglades Planning Project is referred to as CEPP. It really focuses on restoring more natural flows to the Everglades by increasing storage, treatment, and conveyance of that water south of Lake Okeechobee, removing canals and levees within the Central Everglades system, and retaining water within the Everglades National Park, which is just south of the Tamiami Trail, and protecting urban and agricultural areas to the east from flooding so that we can move that water without impacting those beneficial uses of the landscape. And the EAA Reservoir is a component of CEPP and was one of the original 13 components of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, and it was conditionally authorized by Congress in the Water Resources Development Act of 2000, and it remains a keystone of Everglades restoration. It's really the linchpin that pulls all of these projects together to allow us to move that water south. And it's the only CERP project that will provide the dual benefits of reducing the damaging high flow discharges to the estuaries while rehydrating the Everglades in Florida Bay. And combined with other authorized CERP projects, it will reduce the discharge volumes to the estuaries by almost 55%. And it will nearly double the volume of fresh water sent to the Everglades. So that's a significant achievement by just one project. But of course, you know, no one CERP project was designed to achieve all of the benefits of CERP. I'm just going to take a drink of water real quick. So I mentioned that there are some other projects that are non-CERP projects. And one of those is the Kissimmee River Restoration Project. And you can see the map on the left-hand side there showing the Kissimmee River with that straight line being the old ditch system that was dredged going back to the 1880s. And then, of course, it was continued to be further dredged as part of the Central and Southern Florida Project. But the goal is to restore the meandering flow of the Kissimmee by restoring those oxbows and trying to restore the floodplain of the 103-mile Kissimmee River that stretches from Lake Kissimmee down to Lake Okeechobee, and to restore that 3-mile floodplain so that we can put water across the landscape, rehydrating the water, rehydrating the aquifers, slowing that water down before it gets into the lake, and recharging the aquifers. That's going to help slow that water down, improve the quality of that water before it gets to Lake Okeechobee. And another component of the North Storage is what's called the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project, or LORP for short. And that project entails putting in about 80 what are called aquifer storage and recovery wells. Those are wells where we'll pump water into the aquifer, and then we'll pump that water back out when we need it during the dry season for water supply. That's primarily a water supply project, and it will provide some significant storage. But unfortunately, it doesn't provide significant benefits to the estuaries because that water will be pumped into those aquifer storage and recovery wells, or ASR wells, over the period of the entire year. So over the entire year, it'll provide a significant amount of storage. But when we get our peak flows during the wet season, where we can see flows of over 10,000 cubic feet per second coming in from the north into Lake Okeechobee, those wells only provide about 640 cubic feet per second of release. So it's not significant. But again, this is a water supply component of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. And again, all of the projects are different. They provide benefits to different project components. And so it's still an important component of CERP. It's just not going to provide significant benefits to the estuaries. Another project that's important, while it's not a CERP project, it's very important to protect the communities around Lake Okeechobee, and that's the Herbert Hoover Dike Rehabilitation Project. The goal of that project is to rehabilitate the 143-mile earthen dike around Lake Okeechobee that was built in the 1930s. And the Army Corps of Engineers and our federal and state agencies are investing more than $870 million in improvements to the dike to protect the communities around Lake Okeechobee. And that project's slated to be completed in 2025. While this project is not designed to be an ecosystem restoration project, and it's not really being designed to hold more water in Lake Okeechobee. In fact, we hope that more water is not being held in Lake Okeechobee as a result of this project, because we would like to see Lake Okeechobee managed between about 12.5 to 15 feet in depth, so that we don't flood out that marsh, so that we can protect the water quality within the lake, so that we can manage that more like a lake ecosystem rather than a reservoir as it's been managed in the past. More water in Lake Okeechobee generally will result in more damaging discharges to the estuaries, And of course, the Caloosahatchee receives the lion's share of those harmful discharges from Lake Okeechobee. And so another component that's very important, and this is not a CERP component either, but this is very important for the Caloosahatchee and our estuary and coastal waters, as well as the rest of the system. And that's the Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule. And the Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule regulates, it really regulates how much, when, and where water from Lake Okeechobee is sent. And it provides guidance to the Army Corps of Engineers and the state and federal agencies of how to manage the lake. And the image on the left-hand side shows the lake regulation schedule and the different bands. We call them management bands. And generally, the Army Corps of Engineers wants to manage the lake between 12 and 15.5 feet, somewhere in that range, which is beneficial to the lake and, of course, to the estuaries. When water levels get too high, the Army Corps of Engineers has to make releases to the estuaries. And right now, the lake is much higher than we would like to see it. It's around 15.4 feet. And we'd really like to see it around 12.5 feet right now. So we're about 3 feet higher than we'd like to see. So we do expect to see some damaging discharges come late spring or throughout the rainy season this coming year. So we are on a weekly call with the Army Corps of Engineers and agencies to help provide guidance and recommendations on how to manage the lake. And right now we're working on a revision to the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. It's called the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. That project is going to be completed hopefully before 2023. Well, actually 2025 is when the project will be implemented, or the new lake regulation schedule will be implemented. But we'll have a really good idea of what that lake regulation schedule will look like at this time next year. And we're, our SECF and many of the West Coast stakeholders and scientists and water resource managers participate in weekly calls to help guide that process. It's really important because this is probably the only policy decision that will impact the water releases from Lake Okeechobee in the short term. Whereas in the long term, we rely really on those comprehensive Everglades restoration projects to provide that relief. Another project that's very important that will provide benefits to the Caloosahatchee and the Everglades ecosystem is the Tamiami Trail Bridging Project. And the goal of that project is to elevate the Tamiami Trail to allow flow to go under Tamiami Trail and go into Everglades National Park. And that water, after leaving Everglades National Park, will be allowed to move into Florida Bay, where it will help balance the salinity levels in the bay that have been just dramatically impacted by high salinities in the bay, where they've lost thousands of acres of seagrasses, and it's had a direct impact on the fishery in Florida Bay, which of course is a world-class fishery and attracts anglers from all over the world. So that's a really important part of the system that we don't talk enough about, but that's an important part of the system that needs to be restored as well. And the goal of the Tamiami Trail Bridging Project will be to elevate the Tamiami Trail by about along 6.5 miles of bridging to allow that water to move. And what that does is it really helps us pull the plug in the southern end of the system, reducing that bottleneck that currently exists. And of course, that's critical. So as we get the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir completed and the Central Everglades planning projects, this will allow us to convey that water south. Another project that's really critical within the Caloosahatchee watershed is the C43 West Basin Reservoir, and that's located in Hendry County. It'll provide a storage capacity of approximately 170,000 acre-feet of water. And that's going to provide about 40% of the total water storage needs, but it's going to reduce the low flow impacts to the system by about 80%, meaning that it will provide all of the fresh water we need during the dry season 80% of the time, which is a significant benefit to our system. And of course, that will help us balance the freshwater needs in the upper Caloosahatchee and reducing those salinity impacts to the downstream estuary. And this year, we completed what's called a feasibility study for a water quality treatment component for the reservoir, so that the water coming into the reservoir which is somewhat, enriched with nutrients. Not somewhat, it's very enriched with nutrients because it comes from Lake Okeechobee and the watershed of the Caloosahatchee that's impacted by agricultural and urban development. That water leaving the reservoir should be cleaner after it hits that water quality treatment component. And I was actually a member of that feasibility study that helped develop that report, which I feel is a very good report, and hopefully that will come online here shortly as part of the reservoir. And that reservoir is slated to be completed in 2025. And so we talked a lot about the the larger portion of the system and how the Everglades ecosystem will impact freshwater flows to the Caloosahatchee. But we also need to restore the Caloosahatchee watershed because it provides, it contributes about 50% of the problem. We get about 50% of the water from our own watershed. So we need to figure out ways to store, treat, and and move that water around to restore the Caloosahatchee watershed. And when I was working with the city of Sanibel in 2016, we put out what was called the Caloosahatchee Watershed Regional Water Management Issues White Paper. I was a primary author on that document, and it looks at how we can address short and long-term, or provide short and long-term solutions for water storage and treatment within the Caloosahatchee watershed. And it really is a helpful document for guiding strategy for our policymakers and water managers on what projects are needed within the watershed. And we're looking at potentially updating that document over the next few months. So, of course, there are a number of things we need to do in the watershed. First and foremost, we need to enforce the current water quality standards so that the water leaving the landscape is clean and doesn't contribute to those water impairments in the watershed. We need to incorporate more comprehensive land use planning so that development doesn't impact wetlands throughout the watershed. And of course, we need to do a better job of protecting the wetlands throughout the watershed. And I only have 2 more slides, but I just wanted to make you all aware that the Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation works very closely with our other partner agencies along the West Coast and here on the islands. We work very closely with the Ding-Darling National Wildlife Refuge staff and biologists, the city of Sanibel, Lee County, and the city of Cape Coral and the town of Fort Myers Beach to put out a weekly report called the Caloosahatchee Conditions Report. We started this in 2011, and it provides a really good overview of the weekly conditions within the Caloosahatchee and within our coastal waters in Lee County and our islands. And it provides not only a summary of the conditions, but it also provides real-time data collected as part of the Recon Water Quality Monitoring Station sensor array that SECF maintains. And Recon stands for River, Estuary, and Coastal Observing Network. And again, that provides real-time data on water quality, and water managers use that when they're making water management decisions. And of course, you can go to our website if you want to sign up for those water quality reports or check out any of the reports going back all the way to 2011. But water managers find that report very helpful. And finally, I just want to give you some resources to be able to follow some of the work that we're doing at SECF. Of course, you can subscribe for our action alerts. This is the website here on the upper right-hand side. You can see I've circled subscribe to our action alerts. You can click on that and put in your information and subscribe. And you can also subscribe to our news alerts that we put out weekly, or actually we have a Wednesday update that actually goes out bi-monthly. And of course, my email address is in the lower right-hand corner here if you want to email me directly to talk about water resource issues. I'm always available. And of course, we have a number of other program areas here at SECF that are a great resource to you. But I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you tonight, and hopefully we'll have some good questions that we can talk about. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, James.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
No.
Just a second. Who has questions? I had asked the audience to post in the chat room, and some of you may be either shy or don't have a keyboard in front of you, so feel free to unmute your resource there. I think that Angie, you had a question. Angela, please unmute your computer on the lower left-hand corner.
Okay, I have one question. What is the current balance of discharge into the west and east coast at the moment?
Yeah, so thank you, Andrew. That's a great question. We are receiving all of the discharges from the lake when you compare the two estuaries. So the St. Lucie estuary on the east coast is currently not receiving any discharges from Lake Okeechobee, while the Caloosahatchee is receiving about 2,000 cubic feet per second. Now, again, the estuaries are very different. During the dry season, we do need flows. Although, because of the nutrient load that comes from Lake Okeechobee, we would really prefer to see those discharges somewhere around 1,000 cubic feet per second, not 2,000. But we also recognize, because the lake is almost 3 feet higher than we would like to see, we're trying to get the lake levels down. We would like to see some freshwater discharges going not only potentially east, but we would like to see more of that water moving south into the Everglades. But unfortunately, much of the capacity in the Everglades stormwater treatment areas is being taken up by the Everglades agricultural area runoff. So we're not able to move water into that system right now because the stormwater treatment areas and water conservation areas are too high. Yeah. So that's really created a real problem for us. But that's the whole goal of the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, that Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule that I mentioned. The goal will be to make that more equitable so that we're not getting all of the flows and the damaging discharges and the nutrients coming from the lake.
Okay, yeah, because I was wondering that if it was more discharged to the east coast, the dispersal by virtue of going into a big body of water like the Atlantic would be preferable as well.
Yeah, so that's a very good point as well. Unfortunately, because of the proximity of Lake Okeechobee to the east coast, which is about 15 miles compared to Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee, which is almost 70 miles, the impacts from the nutrients that come from Lake Okeechobee can actually impact the estuaries in the St. Lucie and the coral reefs and ecosystems along the Atlantic almost immediately because of the stretch of between the lake and the coast. But that doesn't mean that the Caloosahatchee is not being impacted. We are directly being impacted. It's just that we don't see those impacts as quickly. But it's about shared adversity. We would like to maybe call it shared prosperity, but unfortunately, it's all about shared adversity, and we would really like to see other parts of the system taking some of that water before the rainy season, because we know nobody is lining up to take that water come the rainy season.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Diane. Why does the Caloosahatchee seem to receive most of the water?
Yeah, I think I just answered that question. We receive most of the water, primarily because of the way the system was designed, because the capacity of the Caloosahatchee is higher. But it's really also about politics. The East Coast has been very organized. The East Coast has been on the same page, and they have a simple message. That simple message is, we don't want any water. Our message is a little more convoluted. We want water during the dry season, but we don't want too much water during the wet season. And of course, we want just the right amount of water, but we're concerned about the nutrients that come in that water. So it's challenging. It's easy when you have a simple message. And so I think we need to do a better job of organizing and putting more pressure on our legislators. I really think it's an issue of political will. And if we had more buy-in from our legislators to push more for our issues, we'd probably see more action.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that the next question follows from that. Aside from contacting our legislators, as Teresa, what can the community do to help?
Yes, so the community can be engaged, not just when we're seeing harmful algal blooms, but when the conditions are fantastic. Like, over the last couple of months, the water clarity has been fantastic. Although we have seen some red tide blooms out there, we need people engaged all the time. so that people are supporting those projects. We tend to see the projects get support when we see a harmful algal bloom, like the 2018 or 2016 or 2005 and 2007 events. But of course, that support wanes when conditions are good. We need support all the time, and it requires everybody being engaged. Your votes do matter. As you all know, when Governor DeSantis was elected in 2018, when he took office, he issued an executive order that immediately made water quality a priority. And of course, he removed the existing governing board of the South Florida Water Management District and appointed a board that wanted to balance the needs of the system of focusing more on the needs of the estuaries and the water quality and local economies. And of course, he appointed Chauncey Goss from Sanibel as the chair of the governing board. So your votes matter. So I'd encourage you to speak up and vote.
Thank you. And then Andrew asks, the lake has dropped 7 inches in 3 months. So how is it possible the lake will drop 3 feet by rainy season? And how do the reservoirs help manage nutrient load?
Thank you, Andrew, for that question. That's a really good question. So yeah, you don't get there based on the projections looking back. We would need to drop over the next 12, let's just say the next 12 weeks between now and June 1st. You would have to drop the lake approximately 1/4 of a foot per week, to be able to get there. So that recession rate exceeds what many of the people looking out for the ecology of Lake Okeechobee would like to see. So I don't think we're going to get there. If I had to bet where we'll be come June 1st, I think the lake's going to be somewhere between 13.5 and 14 to 14.5 feet, which is not where we want to be entering the rainy season. Last year we entered the rainy season, I think it was like 12.87 feet, somewhere in that range. And we still received damaging discharges to the estuary in late September. So, we're in a bad position. And as far as your question as related to the reservoirs really provide that storage that we need to hold that water so we can move it around. And it provides the Army Corps of Engineers some operational flexibility to move that water around. It's really the stormwater treatment areas or the filter marshes that will help treat that water as it leaves the reservoirs before it goes south. But again, without conveyance to the south, we're still going to receive damaging discharges. So if we only do the project to the north, where I talked about the restoration of the Kissimmee or the Lake Okeechobee water restoration or watershed restoration project, where we put water into the ASR wells, that doesn't solve our problems. We need that conveyance south so that we can store it, treat it, and move it south. And of course, that water has to be clean enough to go into the Everglades to meet that 10 parts per billion total phosphorus threshold. And that's a heavy lift as well. But I think we can do it if we implement CERP.
Well, any other questions? If not, I want to thank everyone for being here today. And James, thank you so much for a great job, and wish you luck with your pursuits and your passion for our environment and the water. And a month from now, on March 25th, we'll reconvene here with a talk on ocean acidification and mollusks. Thanks, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. Bye-bye. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.